Let's think about these silent witnesses. The first silent witness to the resurrection is the broken Roman seal. Now, the Roman soldiers would have put this Roman seal on the tomb, which stood for the power and authority of the Roman Empire. The consequences of breaking that seal were extremely severe. You could even be crucified upside down for doing something. So it was a really fearful thing to think about breaking the seal. Now, during Jesus' arrest and trial, his disciples had lost all courage and they'd run off and hidden. Peter, who was one of the lead disciples, even denied Jesus 3 times. So who broke the Roman seal? It doesn't really add up that it was the disciples, because it was just too scary to do that. Or what about the enemies of Jesus? Would they have broken the Roman seal? Well, it would have served no purpose for them to break the seal. In fact, they wanted Jesus' body sealed up. The lack of a credible explanation for the broken Roman seal is a silent witness. Here's another silent witness, the empty tomb. After the resurrection of Jesus and the disciples saw the resurrected Jesus, they went out with boldness now and preached that Jesus had risen from the dead. But where did they start preaching this message? Well, they didn't start off in Athens or Rome. They actually started preaching that Jesus rose from the dead in Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus had been crucified and buried. Now, if their claim was false, it would have been very, very easy to show it. If the tomb wasn't empty, then the claim that Jesus had risen could have been disproved in a matter of minutes by just going to the tomb and saying, there's his body. The lack of a credible explanation for the empty tomb is a silent witness. The third silent witness is the large stone rolled away, moved. On the Sunday morning, the first thing that impressed the people who approached the tomb of Jesus was the unusual position of this 1.5 to 2 ton stone that would have been lodged in front of the opening of the tomb. It had been moved. All the gospel writers mention it, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And those who investigated the stone after the resurrection described its position as being sort of rolled up a slope from the tomb. It was in such a position that it looked like it had been sort of picked up and carried away. Now you've got to ask yourself this. If the disciples had wanted to come and steal the body of Jesus to make out he had risen, they'd have to have tiptoed around the sleeping guards. Then they would have had to have rolled away this 2-ton stone, breaking the seal of the Roman Empire. And they would have had to have done that without waking the guards up. It just doesn't make sense unless there was some supernatural intervention. The lack of a credible explanation for the removal of the stone is a silent witness. Silent witness number 4. The Roman guards run away. They go AWOL. They just fled. They left their position of responsibility. Now, it's interesting that to do that would mean the death penalty. When a Roman guard was put to guard something, then he had to guard, otherwise he would lose his life. These Roman guards, we're told, ran away. What was it that made them run away? The lack of a credible explanation for why the Roman guards went AWOL from those who try to explain away the resurrection is a silent witness. The 5th silent witness is the grave clothes. I mean, it's interesting that John, a disciple of Jesus, was the first to go into the tomb and see where Jesus had been. Now, the body of Jesus was not there, but the tomb wasn't empty, actually, because there were the grave clothes there in the form of a body, a bit like a sort of chrysalis, a caterpillar's cocoon thing. And this really struck in the minds of the disciples. So the tomb was empty of the body of Jesus, but not these grave clothes. Now, if you were stealing a body, would you take the body out of the grave clothes first? Of course not, you just take the whole thing. The 6th silent witness is the New Testament documents. they began to be circulated within the lifetime of the disciples of Jesus. Now, the documents all differ, but there's no contradiction in the story of the resurrection of Jesus. And in one sense, this is great proof that they didn't get together to make up exactly the same story. Actually, when you read these documents in first reading, you might think there are contradictions. For instance, one of the Gospels talks about women coming to the tomb, and another just says Mary went to the tomb. Now, at first reading, that might feel like a contradiction. Of course, it isn't. It's just that one writer is focusing in on one woman and the other writer is focusing on the crowd of women. And actually, there's no documents found that suggest that the New Testament is wrong in declaring an empty tomb. Again, the silence of people refuting the New Testament claims is quite loud. The seventh silent witness. No one ever saw Jesus rise, actually rise. They saw the risen Jesus, but not him actually rise from the dead. And I just reckon if you were writing this story, you'd have someone say, yeah, I was standing there and I saw him stand up. You know, he was dead and he came alive again. What I'm trying to say is that the story rings true. The eighth silent witness are the women who were the first witnesses of the risen Jesus. Now, why this is important is that in the culture and the time that Jesus rose from the dead, women's testimony didn't count. You know, it always had to be the testimony of a man. So if the followers of Jesus were making up this story, they wouldn't have put women in to be the first ones to see the risen Jesus. All of these are silent witnesses, and together they witness to the credibility that Jesus rose again from the dead.